What exactly are Telvanni mushroom houses in Morrowind? Are they living creatures or just buildings shaped like mushrooms? Are they all separate structures or could they actually be parts of one huge organism? And the question that really got me curious, are Telvanni mushroom towers even biologically possible? To explore this, I looked into a few sources like the book Basic Guide to Telvanni Construction from the Tamriel Data Project, as well as a diary from a Bethesda artist and designer who wrote about how he approached the design and construction of Telvanni architecture. Everything I found made me way more excited than I expected. But to really understand it all, I had to dig into some unfamiliar terms, things like agarical fungi, mycelium, hyphae, and more. That eventually led me down a rabbit hole of mushroom videos, Reddit posts, Wikipedia articles, you get the idea. So yeah, before we talk about Telvanni mushroom houses, let's first talk about what a mushroom actually is, because it turns out it's not nearly as obvious as I thought. I definitely learned a lot of things I had no idea about. Okay, first things first, a mushroom is not a vegetable, not a plant, and definitely not an animal. Funny enough, biologically mushrooms are actually closer to animals than plants. They belong to their own kingdom of life called fungi. And the singular form of fungi is fungus, which refers to a single organism in that kingdom. Now, here's the mind-blowing part. What we see above ground is only a small part of the fungus, basically just one organ. It's called the fruiting body and its job is simple: to reproduce. Just look at the shape. Now I can see it clearly. Well, it really does look like a reproductive organ. No idea how I never noticed that. It's one of those things I'll never be able to unsee. I was planning to make mushroom soup tomorrow. Not anymore. The rest of the fungus, which is actually the biggest part, lives hidden underground as mycelium, a network of hair-like threads called hyphae. Hyphae are wild. They digest their surroundings by releasing enzymes and acids that break down food outside their bodies, then slurp it back up. It's like having your stomach on the outside. So how does mycelium even start? It all begins from a tiny spore. That spore grows threads in all directions, searching for food, and all those threads eventually form the mycelium. When conditions are just right, the fungus grows a fruiting body out of the ground, the mushroom. Its main job is to release spores, tiny little reproductive units that can float away in the wind and grow into a whole new fungus. Once the spores are gone, the mushroom has done its job, it's not needed anymore, and then it typically starts to decompose. Gentlemen, you're lucky that humans only have some biological similarities to fungi. Okay, so the whole fungus life cycle I just talked about is of course very simplified. We don't need to go into more details right now. There are more interesting things about the world of fungi that I'll mention while talking about specific aspects of Telvanni mushroom houses, and guys, some of them are honestly mind-blowing. But before we dive into all of that, I want to point out that I'm not a mycologist or a fungi expert. I learned all of this from the internet, so I wouldn't be surprised if some facts aren't exactly true, or if I misunderstood something and I'm accidentally spreading a bit of fake news right now. Hopefully not. If you know a lot about the world of fungi and notice anything that isn't quite right, feel free to mention it in the comments. Okay, so let's start with what we can find in the book Guide to Telvanni Construction. Right from the beginning we learn something really important. Telvanni towers are not plants. They are actually fungal in nature. That alone already confirms that comparing them to real-life fungi makes total sense. And here's where it gets really wild. All pot houses in a Telvanni town are part of the same organism. Instead of being several smaller fungi scattered around the countryside, they're all just outgrowths of the massive towers rising from the heart of the settlement. The book says that some structures in some towns are separate, so technically there might be more fungus in one town. But for now, let's think of it as one huge organism and return to some mushroom theory. There's another interesting fact that helps explain how Telvanni cities function. A fungus's mycelium can connect to multiple plants, forming a sort of underground internet of the forest. Through this network, plants can share nutrients, warn each other about pests or disease, and even support weaker neighbors. Of course, it's not all nice. Fungi can also steal nutrients, sometimes harming or even destroying a plant. And these networks can happen on a really large scale. I've read that the largest fungus in the world is in the US state of Oregon. It covers about 3.5 square miles, and wait for it, it weighs 35,000 tons. Just imagine how many plants it can be connected to and how much data could be traveling underground between all those plants and fungus. Could Telvanni structures do that too? Just think about that for a moment. Every single building in a Telvanni town comes from one fungus. Based on what we already know about fungi, that means all these buildings are actually one organism sharing information through a mycelium network, almost like a shared brain. And as we know, fungal mycelium can connect to other plants and communicate with them. So technically, if a threat appeared at the edge of the island and there happened to be a plant nearby, it could pass that information through the network and warn the entire town. Who knows, maybe in a world like Morrowind, mycelium could grow so large that it even connects to underwater plants. Those could sense unusual vibrations in the water, like ships approaching, and quickly signal the town. After receiving such a warning, the mushroom houses could prepare and switch into a kind of defensive mode, perhaps releasing poisonous spores into the air. And during an attack, thanks to such a massive network, damaged mushroom houses could be repaired quickly using nutrients supplied by surrounding plants connected to the system. And once you mix all of that with magic, the defensive possibilities are basically endless. I also looked at the designer notes to see if he had the one organism idea in mind. He imagined a wizard or a few of them planting a magic seed, dancing, singing, and doing all sorts of rituals. From that spore, a massive central trunk would grow, forming the main tower. From there, roots, tendrils, and long twisting growths would spread outward, creating the basic skeleton of the village or metropolis. Pods would then grow from those structures, becoming homes and shops for the people living there. So yeah, he really did have the idea of one big connected organism in mind, and he even mentions how powerful wizards could use that to their advantage. Because everything is organically connected, the wizard in the main tower could basically control the whole settlement. The designer imagined angry Telvanni masters cutting off nutrients to certain areas, literally getting rid of a pothouse or forcing huge roots to burst out of the ground and destroy some offensive structure. Finding out all of that got me even more excited. I hadn't thought about it before, but the idea of roots and tendrils smashing the houses of disobedient residents or defending the town from attackers with those long, tough roots really fired up my imagination. Now, let's see what the book says about actually creating a Telvanni tower, since this description goes into more detail. First of all, magic is absolutely required for proper growth, along with a huge amount of expertise across multiple fields. It's incredibly important to understand which shapes are actually suitable for people to live in. There are many factors to consider. You need to know growth patterns that offer the greatest structural stability, as well as the conditions in which the fungus can survive long term. And conditions are super important in real life too. For a fungus to actually develop from a spore, it needs the right moisture, temperature, nutrients, and often a specific surface. Most spores just dry out or get destroyed. But here is the really wild part. Hyphae can break down almost anything, like soil, wood, rocks, even asphalt. Of course, it depends on the species. Some can even digest the lignin, the tough structural stuff in wood that nothing else could break down before fungi evolved. Fun fact, this is part of the reason massive coal formation on Earth basically stopped, because fallen trees now decompose instead of getting buried and turned into fossil fuel. Pretty wild, right? I took a closer look at mushrooms inside Reef Mora, and they have that classic look. Cap, stem, and gills under the cap. So these are guilty mushrooms, the fruiting bodies of agarical fungi. I was trying to figure out the conditions needed for guilt fungi to grow, but honestly, it was pretty hard to find solid info. If any of you know, I'd love to hear about it. From what I've seen online, it probably depends on the species, but here's what I do know. The mushrooms I used to collect as a kid with my parents in the forest tended to grow in the fall, usually after rainy days. So moisture is definitely a key factor, at least for the mushrooms I picked. And those weren't actually guilty mushrooms, just ones that have a spongy surface with pores under the cap, like porcini. Okay, but let's go back to the book. It also mentions that entire Telvanni cities can be grown from a single spore. We already know that a town is one organism, but I love that someone actually points out it all starts from just one tiny spore. And just imagine that, one tiny thing, basically invisible to naked eye, that can grow into an enormous mycelium producing on the fruiting bodies where the Telvanni live. Honestly, when you think about the largest fungus in the real world, which is just one huge underground mycelium, it suddenly doesn't sound that impossible to grow a whole city from a single spore, especially in a fantasy world. The only thing is, from what I read online, one spore itself usually can't produce mycelium that makes fruiting bodies. It has to connect with another compatible mycelium created from a different spore to do that. So technically, you need two spores. But fungi can also reproduce asexually. From what I understand, that's more like cloning, and normally fruiting bodies aren't created that way. In this case, one fungus can make a bunch of mini-me fungi without needing anyone else. The mycelium can produce spores on its own, and these spores are genetically identical to the parent. With the right conditions, those spores can grow into new mycelium. I guess that in Morrowind, asexual reproduction could also create fruiting bodies. But that is not the only difference from our world. Just look at the size of mushrooms in Morrowind. They're huge. That means the underground mycelium must be massive too. In that case, I don't see any reason why fungi couldn't reproduce asexually and still produce a fruiting body. After all, it's a fantasy world. And let us not forget, magic is part of everyday life for the Telvanni, so they can definitely bend nature's rules. The book even mentions that to create something this large and spectacular, the spore needs a magical catalyst. For that, at least 2 grand soul gems filled with appropriately strong souls are required. We learned this not only from the book, but also while creating our own Telvanni stronghold in the game. On top of that, the future owner must also make a sizable financial contribution. Interestingly, the one thing a wizard doesn't need to provide is the spore itself. The book explains that there is actually an oversupply of unused spores, and honestly, that makes a lot of sense. From what I've read in the real world, a single mushroom can produce tens of thousands of spores every second, which adds up to billions of spores over its lifetime. And here in Morrowind, we have mushrooms that seem to never decompose, probably thanks to magic. Just imagine how many spores are floating around, especially considering how massive Telvanni mushrooms are. The bigger the mushroom, the more spores it likely releases, and Morrowind's mushrooms are absolutely enormous. Of course, it's also possible that Telvanni wizards simply block the release of spores on a daily basis, and the mushroom only releases them on demand, either to go into a defensive state with poisonous spores or to drop some spores for building new Telvanni towers. Okay, so how does the building process actually work? I thought I already knew the answer because I'd built my Telvanni stronghold in the game, but before reading the book, I honestly assumed it was pretty easy. I imagined it as a one wizard job. You grab 2 filled soul gems with some powerful souls, cast 1 or 2 spells, wait a bit, deliver some construction plans, cast another spell so the mushroom grows into the right shape, and then wait a few more days for everything to finish growing. Turns out, not even close. According to the book, building a Telvanni tower is highly specialized work and requires a moderate number of laborers. It's definitely not just one wizard waving their hands and calling it a day. Sometimes the people in charge of construction get a bit creative and make their own demands. Let me read it. These unforeseen obstacles can range from simple male boredom, easily solved with the addition of women, to suggestions of enhancing security. Well, when we build a stronghold, we run into the second issue, the security measure. The wizard suggests we need guards to protect our property, so we have to find a book containing sketches of women machines she plans to build to defend the stronghold. You can actually see these machines around your stronghold once it's completely ready. I wonder if the other obstacle, the simple male boredom, could be easily solved by sending those men to Suram. Okay, but let's go back to the building process. The spore is carefully seeded along with the soul gems and then supervised over a period of time. I guess this is probably the stage where the spore starts feeding itself, growing hyphae and forming a mycelium. Within just a few days, a small number of mushrooms rise from the sides. And I'm pretty sure these are what are called pins. If you look closely at the mycelium, you can sometimes see tiny dark dots on it. Those are mushrooms just starting to grow. A few days later, they look like this. And then a few days after that, voila, we've got mushrooms ready. What's cool is that the growth timing in Morrowind actually lines up pretty well with what we see in real fungi. The only real difference is the size, which is obviously much bigger here thanks to magic. In Morrowind, according to the book, once the mushrooms start rising, specialists step in and allow them to access the power stored inside the soul gems they've grown around. The Telvanni wait until the fungus fully envelops the gems so the magical energy feeds the fungus instead of going to waste. They can even control how fast the fungus grows by adjusting how much energy the gems release. That also explains why new Telvanni cities can appear relatively quickly while older ones stay more or less the same. Once the fungus is ready, the familiar mushroom shapes begin to twist into those exotic Telvanni designs. Even with magical energy helping, it still takes a lot of skilled craftsmen to guide those tiny buds into the large hollow pots that eventually become homes. So yes, someone actually has to stand there and shape all those pots and towers with magic. Isn't all of this just amazing? The level of detail in this book is incredible. The author was clearly inspired by real fungi and how they actually work. This isn't just random fantasy stuff made up for the game. It's real biological concepts mixed with magic in a really thoughtful way. And after reading all of this, I personally started wondering about one more thing. How durable are these mushroom houses really? Because normally mushrooms are pretty easy to break. And once they release their spores, they start to decompose and get that soft, soggy, chewy texture. So I guess in Morrowind, mushroom houses must have other properties. We can find some information about this aspect in the book. The structures in Telvanni towns don't need any additional support at all. A growing organism like this is naturally tough, and once you add magic into the mix, it needs very little maintenance. Telvanni don't have to worry about leaky roofs, rotting wood, or most of the everyday problems normal houses deal with. So I guess magic allows these mushrooms to be tougher, grow faster, reach much bigger sizes than anything we see in our world, be shaped into livable forms, and even stop the normal decomposition process that usually starts after a mushroom releases its spores. But are there any more similarities between Morrowind fungi and real fungi? There actually is a really interesting detail mentioned in the book. The fungus can filter salt from water, making it drinkable for both elves and men. That alone explains a lot. That's probably one of the main reasons Telvanni towns are built on islands. And honestly, I love this explanation for how Telvanni get their water. These islands are surrounded by seawater, and we don't really see any obvious freshwater sources. Before, I just assumed they used magic to conjure water, or maybe magically filter seawater. But houses that can filter water on their own? That's way cooler. And what's even better is that this idea actually has roots in the real world. There is something called mycoremediation, which is a form of bioremediation where fungi are used to clean up contaminated environments. Fungi have been proven to be a cheap, effective, and environmentally friendly way to remove all kinds of pollutants from soil and wastewater. Wikipedia lists things like heavy metals and other toxins, though unfortunately it doesn't specifically mention salt. So if any of you are mycologists or just fungi enthusiasts, feel free to share your knowledge here. Even if fungi can't filter salt in real life, it's clear that someone was inspired by their ability to filter other substances. There is one more advantage mentioned in the book that comes from the fungus's ability to absorb water. While it's not officially proven, all that moisture combined with the fungus's ability to absorb water probably means these homes aren't very flammable either. And this part actually made me smile because before I read the book, I'd seen a few Reddit threads about Telvanni towns. One of them asked the question, how would the Telvanni mushroom structure defend against a dragon attack? Well, based on what's written here, dragon fire might not be very effective. Even if parts of the mushroom were damaged, I imagine the structure could regenerate pretty quickly thanks to its massive mycelium and its connections to other plants across the island. Those plants could provide nutrients to help the Telvanni house rebuild itself. And as I've mentioned a few times already, magic could support that too. And let's be honest, mushrooms have one more nasty trick: spores. A dragon attacking with teeth and claws might suddenly find itself flying through clouds of toxic spores, inhaling them straight into its lungs. Meanwhile, anyone inside the mushroom towers or pods would probably be completely safe. Add a bunch of powerful wizards on top of that, and it really starts to feel like Telvanni towns were designed so their residents could calmly continue their experiments even during a full-on attack. What do you think? Let's switch to Telvanni interiors because the book actually has some really cool details about those too. When you finally step inside a Telvanni tower, your eyes will probably go straight to the man-sized purplish crystals you find in the older lower sections. At first, they look mysterious and a little unsettling, but once you think about the building materials, they start to make perfect sense. These crystals are actually old soul gems twisted and reshaped through Telvanni magic and their cooperation with the fungus. Once I've read about it, I thought about the council house and its gems. I started wondering how many soul gems were used to build the Telvanni council house, since it looks to me like more than two. While thinking about it, another thought hit me. The building must have been grown from a different spore entirely. Soul gems are only used when a new spore is seeded, which means Sadrif Mora actually has at least two separate fungi. One is the Telvanni council house and the other is Tel Naga with all its connected pod houses. It was actually mentioned at the beginning of the book that some buildings may be separate from the whole organism, and I think the Telvanni council house is a perfect example of that. There are a few more interesting things about Telvanni interiors mentioned in the book. Inside, the air is warm and slightly damp, but it barely feels like you're inside a living organism. You often find vertical shafts that require levitation to reach higher levels. This not only saves space inside the tower, but also keeps most outsiders away, since the Telvanni, especially on the mainland, aren't exactly welcoming to visitors. The tops of the towers are usually flat, offering great views of the surrounding area and a secure place for summoning. And honestly, the idea of summoning at the top of a tower is kind of perfect. You'd think they do that sort of thing deep in the basement during some secret experiment. But with Telvanni personalities, it actually makes sense to enjoy the sunset with a weird summoned creature standing next to you. They're not exactly the sit with friends and family type, so a summoned being feels like the ideal companion. You know what else bothers me about Telvanni towers? The one we can build ourselves. Why is it not on some nice island? Especially now that we know these mushrooms can filter water and are almost not flammable near water sources. The ocean region of Mollagamur feels completely wrong for a mushroom home, and the book even backs this up. It lists ideal regions for Telvanni towers like the Telvanni Isles, Azura's Coast, and Boethia's Spine, places that provide the right conditions to keep these structures stable. It also mentions that towers haven't really been built in the harsh ocean region of Mollagamur, and if they ever are, they would probably need extra care. So in that case, thank you Telvanni, truly. You gave me a stronghold with no proper access to water, surrounded by ash in a place where my mushroom home is far more vulnerable than it should be. There isn't even a boat that conveniently takes me there. And the more I think about it, the more it starts to make sense in a very Telvanni way. I honestly feel like they just used me as their next experiment. Maybe they wanted to see if mushroom towers could survive in that region, so they decided to test it on some noob who doesn't really know much about Telvanni construction. And somewhere out there, some Telvanni wizard is probably laughing at me, enjoying Sujama on the flat top of a tower, watching the sunset with a very weird cement creature by their side. What do you think? There are two more things I want to talk about. First, could these Telvanni mushrooms actually be edible, and would they taste good? Since they are guild mushrooms, there's a good chance they could be. And honestly, I can imagine a Telvanni wizard tweaking their properties when planting the seed, maybe making the mushroom edible, or maybe giving it a little defense property where one bite could instantly take you down. But let's assume they're edible. Just think how convenient that would be. Houses that give you fresh water filtered from salt water and food that is high in protein. And thanks to the mycelium network, I imagine you could even nibble on a wall near you and it would grow back. Now, could it be tasty? Absolutely. Let me tell you something. Mushrooms in real life, from what I've seen in some YouTube videos, are often considered to taste best just before they drop their spores. Yay! Another fun fact to boost your appetite. Knowledge is awesome, but it comes with great power and responsibility. Mushrooms, the reproductive organs, are most delicious just before releasing their spores. I'm not sure if I'll ever eat a mushroom again. I wanted to mention that fact about spores because, you know, since Telvanni mushroom houses never actually decompose, I'd guess they're constantly releasing and producing spores. That would mean they are basically at their most delicious phase all the time. Imagine living in a house that gives you water and even has edible mushroom walls. And honestly, it makes sense because Telvanni wizards wouldn't want to bother with something as simple as basic needs. They would come up with a quick solution so they could spend more time on experiments. And that would be super convenient. You wouldn't even have to leave your house to hunt or get groceries. Just grab a spoon or open your mouth and you're ready to dig in. The second thing I want to cover is whether we could recreate a Telvanni mushroom house in the real world. At first, the answer seems like a solid no, but I decided to see what others think, and I actually found a pretty cool explanation on Reddit. Let me give you the quick version. The fruiting bodies of a fungus, the mushrooms you see, are purely reproductive and not built for durability. Most of the organism is actually the mycelium, a network of thin hyphae, which is kind of like the roots of a tree. But the mycelium usually stays in the topsoil because that's where all the decaying organic matter is. More than a meter down, the soil is not nutritious enough, and because the mycelium is so shallow and the hyphae are so thin, it cannot support much weight. Even a gust of wind or the mushroom's own weight could tear it apart, causing the mushroom to collapse. On top of that, the fruiting body itself is too weak to support much weight. So yes, mushrooms the size of Telvanni towers aren't possible with what we know about fungi today. To make it work, a fungus would need two major changes. First, it would have to harden old tissue, kind of like how trees form hardwood so it could support its own weight. Second, it would need deep roots to anchor itself and get enough nutrients. With those those changes, maybe a real-life Telvanni-style mushroom could exist, but for now, it's still pure magic. By the way, do you enjoy game analysis like this, or discussions about the lore and personal stories from Morrowind and other retro games? This year I set up a Discord server focused on these topics, so if you're interested, feel free to join. You can find the link in the channel description or the video description. Hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, thanks for watching!